Today, we're going deep on this speech
Oh, yeah.
by Ibrahim Traoré,
Okay.
President of Burkina Faso.
Right.
And he gave this at the Russia-Africa Summit.
I've heard about this.
Yeah, and this wasn't your typical kind of diplomatic,
Right.
carefully worded kind of speech.
Uh-huh.
This was raw, full of emotion.
Yeah.
It was packed with
Yeah.
questions about Africa's future.
It's interesting.
So we've got his speech, some background on Burkina Faso, and some analysis.
Okay.
Let's see what we can uncover.
Yeah, what struck me right away listening to this was how Traoré just cuts right through all that diplomatic,
Right.
careful wording, very direct.
Yes.
He's speaking to this shared frustration, I think especially among his generation, with these persistent challenges in Africa, despite all the potential.
Even in just a short clip of the speech in French,
Oh, wow.
you feel that intensity? Let's hear it.
Okay.
Just right.
Yeah.
Can you give us the gist for those who don't speak French?
Yeah, so he addresses Putin and the other leaders as comrades,
Okay.
which right away sets a different tone.
Yeah.
He talks about Russia being like family to Africa
Right.
and really emphasizes the history
Okay.
of them fighting against the Nazis together.
Okay.
And then he drops this line,
Okay.
"We are the forgotten peoples of the world."
Wow.
And that feeling of being overlooked
Uh-huh.
really kind of carries through the whole speech.
Yeah, it's like he's speaking for so many
Yeah.
who feel that Africa's potential is being undermined,
Yes.
both from within and outside.
Absolutely.
And the way he says, my generation, over and over,
Yeah.
it suggests this isn't just his opinion,
Right.
but something bigger.
Exactly. He's speaking for a generation that's tired of just empty promises. They want to change things.
Right.
And that's where his critique of neocolonialism comes in.
Okay, let's unpack that.
Okay.
What are some of the specific examples that stand out to you?
Well, he talks about economic exploitation,
Yep.
like unfair trade deals that drain resources,
Right.
but don't benefit the people.
Right.
He also highlights the forced migration of young Africans.
Okay.
They have to leave to seek opportunities
Right.
because there's no future for them at home.
Yeah.
And then he points to the hypocrisy
Okay.
of them being called a militia for defending their homeland
Yeah.
when European resistance fighters are celebrated.
Right. That's powerful.
It really is.
Like, who gets to decide what's acceptable
Yeah,
for African nations to do?
exactly.
And it ties back to that idea of being forgotten.
Right.
Like, Africa's judged by a different set of rules.
Absolutely. It's about agency.
Okay.
Having the right to choose your own destiny
Yeah.
without interference.
And that leads to another interesting part of the speech.
Yeah.
His criticism of other African leaders. He calls out leaders who, he says, sing the same song as the imperialists.
Wow.
So they're not really representing their people.
That's a bold move.
It is, on such a public stage, too. What do you think that means?
I think it points to this growing rift in Africa, maybe even a generational divide.
Right.
On one side, you have those leaders
Right.
who are aligned with the traditional power structure,
Right.
maintaining the status quo.
Okay.
And then on the other side, you have this rising generation, represented by Traoré, who are demanding a real break from the past.
It's like he's calling for a Pan-African reckoning
Yeah,
to reassess who benefits from the current systems.
exactly. This internal critique is so important.
Okay.
True self-reliance means pushing back against outside pressure, but it also requires internal reform
Yeah.
and a unified vision for the future.
So tackling both external and internal obstacles.
Yes,
But where does Russia fit into all of this?
right.
Traoré called them family, but he also stressed the need for self-sufficiency.
Yeah,
How does he reconcile those two things?
that's where it gets really interesting. On the one hand, he expresses gratitude for Russia's support,
Okay.
especially for their grain donations,
Uh-huh.
which helped with the food shortages.
Right.
But then he uses that gesture to challenge African leaders to work towards self-sufficiency in food production.
So they won't need those handouts in the future.
Exactly.
So it's not about rejecting partnerships,
Right.
but about redefining them
Yes.
to serve Africa's long-term interests.
Yes.
It's like he's using the simple example of the grain donations
Right.
to make a much larger point
Exactly.
about rethinking Africa's place in the world.
It highlights this tension between needing support,
Yeah.
but also wanting autonomy.
Right.
It's not simple, but it's at the core of what he's trying to do.
So a more strategic and assertive approach
Yes.
to engaging with the world, where Africa sets its own terms and demands respect.
Exactly.
And his comments about the VDP seem to back that up.
Right.
He pushes back against that militia label
Uh-huh.
and points out the double standard for African nations.
Exactly. He compares them to European resistance fighters,
Right.
challenging that narrative that says African self-defense is bad.
Yeah.
It's about reclaiming their own narrative and protecting their own people.
It makes you think, if a European nation faced those same threats, would their citizens taking up arms be viewed the same way?
Exactly.
It challenges us to examine our own biases about how we see Africa on the world stage.
That challenge is what makes this speech so compelling. He's not just outlining a political agenda.
Right.
He's prompting a change in how we think.
Okay.
He's forcing us to confront some uncomfortable truths about power and perception and the legacy of colonialism. It's really powerful.
It really is, and one that will spark debate, for sure.
For sure.
But before we get into potential paths to achieving this self-reliance, let's look closer at the history that shaped his views. We'll be back after a short break.
So we've talked about Traoré's vision of breaking free from neocolonialism and achieving self-reliance for Africa.
Right, and to really grasp the meaning, we need to dig into the history that he's drawing on.
All right, what's he referencing?
He keeps going back to that shared history. Especially the fight against Nazism. And how that formed a connection between Russia and Africa.
Right, it's not just about fighting together though, right?
No, it's about how that shaped their view of power. Who stood with them and who was against them.
You're right. He even said comrades when talking to Putin. A word loaded with historical and ideological baggage.
Exactly. He's tapping into this well of shared struggle and resentment against those who dismissed or exploited Africa.
So many African soldiers fought bravely alongside the Allies.
They did.
But their sacrifices were downplayed or even erased from history.
And the Soviet Union, who Russia sees itself as a successor to, played a big role in defeating the Nazis. And that resonated in Africa.
It's not just a shared enemy then.
Right.
It's a shared sense of being overlooked.
Having your efforts ignored by the world powers.
And this ties into the Cold War.
Yes.
When the Soviets actively supported African liberation movements.
Right. They gave them weapons, training, and a whole ideology that challenged the West.
The Soviets presented themselves as a champion.
Yes.
Against Western imperialism.
Exactly.
And this resonated with many African nations.
Of course, they were fighting for independence.
Right.
Self-determination.
So they saw the Soviet Union as a potential ally.
Yes. A partner in their struggle.
Okay, so for Traoré, this context is crucial.
It informs his view of the present.
Yeah, he sees those same patterns of exploitation and double standards happening today.
But in more subtle ways.
So he's not just looking back with rose-colored glasses.
No, he's using it to understand now. And this leads to the complexity of Russia's current relationship with Africa. It's not just a continuation of Cold War alliances.
Right.
There are economic interests now, strategic calculations, and a whole new set of challenges and opportunities.
Russia is a major supplier of arms to Africa.
They are.
And they're investing in things like energy and mining. So they clearly see Africa as strategically important.
Absolutely, both economically and geopolitically.
But it's not just one-sided, right?
No, it's not.
African nations also want to diversify their partners.
Right.
Reduce their reliance on the West.
Yes.
And find new avenues for development.
That's where the tension comes in.
And Traoré captures that tension perfectly. He thanks Putin for the grain, but then challenges African leaders to become self-sufficient.
Like he's saying thanks for the help.
Yeah.
But we got to stand on our own 2 feet.
He's walking this line between pragmatism and principle.
He needs external help, but doesn't want to depend on any one power.
Not even Russia.
Right.
So strategic partnerships, not blind allegiance.
Exactly.
And that brings us back to the challenges
in
Burkina Faso and the Sahel.
The security situation is really bad. Extremist groups are taking advantage of poverty, weak governments, and old grievances to gain power.
And that's where the VDP comes in.
Right. They're a grassroots response to this. Filling in where the state can't provide security.
They're seen as a last line of defense.
Yeah, ordinary people taking up arms
to protect their communities
from a really brutal enemy.
It really highlights the complexity of the situation.
It does.
Because some see them as heroes, but they've also been accused of human rights abuses.
It's messy.
Yeah, a messy reality.
And Traoré doesn't shy away from that.
Right.
He acknowledges the problems.
Okay.
But defends their right to exist, to protect their home.
And that's where his criticism of that militia label becomes so powerful.
He's basically saying, don't judge us by your standards.
Okay.
You haven't lived our lives.
Yeah.
You don't understand the choices we have to make.
It's a challenge to the narrative imposed on African nations.
Right, the one that says they can't govern themselves or solve their own conflicts.
Without outside help.
Exactly.
And in that context, Traoré's vision of a self-reliant Africa becomes even more compelling.
It's not just about economics. It's about the right to find their own solutions.
Okay.
Even if those solutions are messy or imperfect.
It's a call for nuance.
It is.
To understand how complicated things are and to recognize there are no easy answers.
Exactly.
And this applies to food security, too.
Yes.
His comments about the grain are simple but profound.
He's grateful, but he also challenges African leaders to break free from needing foreign food aid.
It's like he's using this one example to talk about Africa's potential to feed itself, to be truly self-sufficient, to move from relying on others to being empowered.
And that's where his vision gets exciting.
Okay.
It's not about being isolated or refusing help. It's about redefining those relationships to make sure they benefit Africa in the long term.
So harnessing the potential to create a better future.
It's compelling, but it's a tough road.
It is. There's so many challenges.
There are poverty, conflict,
corruption, lack of infrastructure.
So how do we turn those dreams into action?
Yeah, that's a question.
What are the steps to actually get there?
So we've really gone deep on Traoré's speech.
We have.
The history,